Hey y'all, happy Halloween. I was sitting around on Saturday and I nearly shit myself realizing that I promised a Halloween video and I hadn't actually started on it. So I've kind of been working around the clock to get this one out for you guys. I was thinking to myself, what kind of a horror themed channel would I be to not have have a video come out during Halloween? So yeah, I've been working on this as much as I can for the past 2 days, and sorry if this comes out late. I am editing this at about 4:30 on Halloween day, and then I'm gonna go probably go hang out with some of my friends, do some trick or treating and all that. So yeah, if you guys don't have any plans on Halloween, I guess this video is for you. You can enjoy the soothing sound of my voice as I read to you some spooky tales. Anyways, let's get down to it then. I'm a male, 185 pounds, and 25. I was 23 when this happened. My girlfriend Lauren and I were at my house. It was a ranch style, main level plus basement, near the woods, and there were woods in the backyard, and the closest neighbor was like 7/10 of a mile away. At that point, we'd been dating for 3 months. We were watching a movie. I put the moves on her, and things started getting heavy. A loud crash came from the basement. Think like a bowling ball knocking down bowling pins loud. And I ran down, baseball bat and flashlight in hand. And I searched every crevice, but nothing. No evidence or anything. I chalked it up to just something falling down. I walked back up to Lauren. She's under about like 4 blankets and trying to be as small as possible. I comfort her and reassure her that nothing's wrong. Lauren falls asleep before the movie ends, and I switch to Netflix and eventually fall asleep. I woke up to the shuffling of feet and my front door closing quietly. I'm a pretty light sleeper, I guess. In my sleepy state, I thought it was Lauren leaving. I looked down and nope, she's still in my arms, sound asleep. Okay, fully awake now, I'm up on my feet, and I grab my bat and flashlight. Whoever this was is now outside, and I lock the door. And before walking out like a deer in a hunting arena, I look out each window. Darkness. Nothing. Then, lastly, I look out the window that is above my sink in the kitchen and see what appears to be a 6-foot-tall, burly male with a mask on standing behind a tree with his head poking out, tilted, looking at the house. It was this type of mask. Very The Strangers-esque. I'm fucking panicked like a pussy on the inside, but on the outside I must remain calm and combative. I walk fast to Lauren, wake her up, and whisper, "Don't panic, but there's a guy with a mask on in the backyard. Stay low." She's like, "Seriously? What the fuck, Luke?" She's panic whispering, but stays low on the couch. I stealthily look out the front bay window, and the masked perp is by my fucking garage under the motion light, standing there, motionless. Now that he's in the light, I notice that he has a meat cleaver in his hand. His head is tilted, just looking at my house, his arm limp, cleaver by his side. I get low and army crawl to Lauren, kiss her on the forehead, and I tell her to stay put, that I will keep her and I safe. I keep crawling to the window by my back door close to the garage, and I look out near the motion light. It's off and the masked perp is gone. I slowly stand up, scale the walls to my bedroom. I look out the south side window that is adjacent to my bed. Keep in mind that it is pitch black in my room. I see the masked perp slowly walk down my driveway, back to the house, swinging his arms back and forth, caveman or Bigfoot style. He then stops dead in his tracks, just turns his head, tilts it, looks straight into my bedroom window, at me. He just stands there, and I'm just standing there, like I'm frozen. How did he know which window that I was at? I really have no fucking clue. The fight must have kicked in on full blast at this point because I wasn't playing around anymore. I grabbed my Beretta A300 semi out of my safe and my Surefire 300 flashlight. I also grabbed my 6 Sauer P226. I beelined it to Lauren, handed her the cig, and I told her I'm heading outside. I quickly laced up my combats and unlocked the front door. I quietly opened it, quietly shut it, and quietly locked it behind me. Reese style, I laid down individual surveillance in my land for this masked perp fucker. He wasn't anywhere in sight. I checked everywhere, believe me. I walked back into my house. Lauren is still on the couch, cig in hand. She whispered and asked if anything happened. I said no and that he appeared to be gone. I checked every nook and cranny in my house for safety, while white-knuckling my Beretta. Nothing. Nothing was found and nothing was missing. I never saw the masked perp again. Now I want y'all's theories on what the hell that was about. Keep in mind I am very meticulous when it comes to keeping all doors and windows locked when not in use, even when I am home. Also, the closest neighbor, a sweet old lady and old man who I'm friendly with, is 7/10 of a mile away. So, how did he get in my house? Lauren and I both fell asleep at one point, and why didn't he take action? Why did he leave? Why was he creeping outside? Why was he roaming in my house? And did he watch us while we were sleeping? Where was he hiding when I first checked the basement? And what was that crashing noise? Lastly, why did he choose me? I still don't understand what the fuck happened and what his intentions were. He could have killed us so easily. I'm sorry this isn't as creepy as most posts on this sub, but it scared me to the core. Warning, I know this goes without saying for a lot of these kinds of stories, but this one's especially graphic. I would recommend skipping it if you're a bit squeamish. I've never posted to Reddit before. This is my first time. My brother suggested that I tell my story here. So, I'm a 33-year-old white female from Los Angeles. 3 years ago, my boyfriend and I, as planned for 5 years, when we turned 30, we sold everything we owned, including my car, took his Trailblazer, and decided to just travel around the States and Canada. I guess you could call us backpackers, as we tended to chase good weather, find a state park, and backcountry hike into the wilderness for days at a time. My brother likes to joke that what we are is actually just called anti-establishment hippies. We don't necessarily live off the grid, but between the two of us we have one prepaid phone that we use only for emergencies or checking in with family and friends, and one MacBook which I use for work. I'm a freelance writer / content creator, and I'm living on retainer with robotics company. I mostly write boring white papers or web content. The whole point of our living situation is to live debt-free and have as few bills as possible. I only use free Wi-Fi, so 1 to 2 times a week we have to go to a city with a Starbucks. This background information is important so you know more about who we are and how simply we live. Neither of us are involved in any social media and know very little of Reddit or Instagram, or we don't really use any apps because our phone isn't a smartphone after all. We don't even text. Last summer we decided to do some backcountry hiking in Arkansas. It's one of those states you don't really hear about other hikers visiting, but we read that it had some beautiful nature landscape, and it does. The rules at this particular park were pretty lax, and we didn't even need a permit, so there were a few basic laws and guidelines though, but there wasn't even a check-in needed. We had all the basics and had planned to do a 6-day hike, 3 in and 3 out. The whole time we were out there, we didn't see or hear another soul, but on day 1, we were prepping to move off trail and find a camping spot as it was getting near dusk. 1.5 mile off trail is usually the standard for us. We took what looked like kind of an animal trail, and about half a mile out we saw a green 2-person tent. It was almost camouflaged in the foliage, so we came on it almost by accident. Some backpackers prefer privacy and others are more social. We're more the social type. We've gotten some great experiences camping near other backpackers, sharing stories, food, a joint or two maybe. We were around 30 yards away from the tent, and it was zipped closed, and my boyfriend shouted a greeting to make our presence known. No movement and no sound. We assumed that green tent guy either wasn't around or didn't want to be bothered, so we started off in a new direction to get some distance between us. We camped and never heard a peep. We moved along the next morning, completely forgetting my green tent guy until nearing the end of the day 5 on our trek back. We were again looking for a spot to camp off the trail when we came up on the green tent again. This isn't that unusual, but normally backcountry hikers keep moving, so we just really weren't expecting it. The tent flap was open, so my boyfriend yells his greeting again, and nothing again. My boyfriend wants to go check it out, saying that it's weird and maybe somebody's hurt. I didn't like the idea from the get-go, because even though we hadn't had any bad experiences personally, we'd heard enough stories from other backpackers about hermits and mountain men that want privacy or carrying guns and etc. But my boyfriend assured me that we'd be fine, and if all else fails, we could just offer him some weed to help keep the peace and we'd be on our way. As soon as we get within 20 yards of the place, the smell of decomposition is horrible. My boyfriend has been hailing his greeting over the last 20 yards, and once the smell hits him, he stops and turns to me and says, "What if we find a dead body?" My skin crawled. I was immediately afraid. I've never seen a dead body before, and I don't want to. The closer we got to the tent, the worse the smell got. I knew for sure we were going to walk in and see some old camper's rotting corpse. What we found was even worse than that. Outside the tent were 4 dead doe legs, covered in flies. It looked like the legs had been cut off most of the way and then just ripped off the rest of the way. It was a mess. Inside was the body and head of the deer, but the middle portion was swaddled in a black fleece blanket that was blood-soaked at the bottom where the legs used to be. It was laying on its side, bottom facing the tent entry. The tail had been cut off and the anus or vagina, we couldn't even tell, was covered in dried blood and a gape, like something had been penetrating it. The same with its mouth. The bottom portion was bent down at a scary, broken-looking angle. The tent was open, so we could see everything without even having to go inside. Not that we would have anyways, because at this point the smell was almost debilitating. There was a dirty, almost empty, clear bottle of Jergens baby oil and a stained green and white fringed kitchen towel. That was it. I immediately started crying and begged him to go. All he could muster was a, "What the fuck?" and we turned and ran. We ran to the trail and jogged down it for as far as we could go until dusk was finally on us and we had to set up camp. We didn't go very far off the trail and neither of us slept. We didn't start a fire or use headlamps after full dark. We just sat up whispering to each other, going over and over what we had just seen. Every little noise startled us. It was like our brains were on red alert. I kept thinking any moment the dead deer rapist would come back to his tent, see our footprints or something, and know we were there and track us back to our tent. I've never been so scared in my entire life. Just before dawn, we tore down and started out. My boyfriend stopped at the ranger station on our way out of the park to report what we had seen. The ranger was a young guy around our age, and he looked about as freaked out by our story as we were. He wrote down most of it, and my boyfriend showed him on the map approximately where it was. He asked if we knew how the deer was killed, and at this point we hadn't even thought about it. We just assumed it had been shot, but because of the blanket we didn't see a wound, but we weren't exactly giving it an autopsy either. We have since shortened our backcountry hikes to a maximum of 4 days. We're also a lot less eager to call out to other campsites and have never approached another unmanned tent again. I have a story that I was only partially there for, but my ex-girlfriend was present for the latter half. So this was when I was much younger, when I was in college. I'm sure you can find this in the local news, or the local Rhode Island news anyways, if you tried hunting for it. I was dating a girl that went to school in Providence, Rhode Island. It was the summer, and everyone was back home. My girlfriend's best friend had an internship back in Providence, and this girl had a 4-bedroom multifamily home to herself. The other 3 roommates were paying for their rooms but chose to stay home. I guess they could only get this place if they started paying rent 2 to 3 months prior to the school year starting, but whatever. One weekend, my girlfriend asked me to go to Providence with her to spend time with her friend. She's lonely and has nothing to do on the weekends. We're only 1 hour from Providence, so it sounds like a plan. We head down and just chill for the night, drinking and doing some cocaine. It's about 2 a.m. and we decide to walk out and get some cigs, nothing special. We walk by a guy on our way home from the gas station who was just staring at us. Kinda creepy, but no big deal, as it is 2 a.m. in Providence, and her house wasn't located in the best of areas, but certainly not the worst at the same time. We eventually all pass out, and me and my girlfriend head home the next day. The end of the week comes in, my girlfriend asks if I want to go to Providence again, but I can't as I have to work all weekend, so I decline. She heads down there, and her friend's boyfriend is coming to stay over. Pretty much a repeat of the weekend before. They all drink, but end up going out and partying a little bit. They're walking back after a night of drinking when they enter the mudroom at around 2 a.m. They close the mudroom door behind them, which was left unlocked, and there's a dude that's really ragged looking in there, waiting for them. He says out loud to them,
"Get in the fucking house."
They all turn around and he has a gun. My girlfriend's friend has already unlocked the door to the house and it's partially open. Everyone is frozen in place and the guy repeats himself,
"Get in the fucking house."
The boyfriend then steps forward with his hands up a little bit as to not seem confrontational and says, "Hey man, calm down, it's all good." I don't know how the fuck this dude is brave enough to do any of this, but as he says that, the dude shoots him. My girlfriend and her friend run into the house and hide under a bed. They can't hear this, but the assailant took off and didn't follow them back in. They didn't know this though, and they're terrified, hiding under a bed while the boyfriend is screaming for help. They think the psycho has come into the house and is looking for them. My girlfriend said that they were both silently crying under the bed while the boyfriend screams for help and, this is the worst part, yelling out, "Help me, I'm dying." The neighbors heard the gunshot and screaming and called the police. They ended up catching the dude. He had been watching the girl for weeks. It was the guy we had seen watching us the week prior, as a matter of fact. The worst part is, the girl's boyfriend ended up dying. Update, a user messaged me with some info and added a comment with it, but I'm gonna add it to the post. This is what he said. "Yeah, I remember when this happened. I believe it's right off of Broadway on Cortlandt Street, right by the gas station. My friends had just moved into an apartment around the corner. And if I'm not mistaken, my current coworker lives in this house with her boyfriend. They got a little bit of a deal on it, but they didn't realize why until they moved in, as there's still bloodstains in the hallway." I had a job vacancy at our company. I'm the head of HR and conduct all the interviews. I had an interview planned about a week ago for a guy to attend. When he arrived, I invited him up to my office and waited for him at the top of the stairs. He was young and dressed in a tracksuit. The problem was that he had emailed me the day before asking what dress code was here and that if he could have some advice about the interview attire, and I had informed him to dress smartly. I said hello to him, and he just stopped and stared at me before asking if there were any men to interview him. I said, "Nope, I'm the interviewer," to which he simply replied, "Oh, I just would have rather spoken to a man, you know what I'm saying?" I point blank ignored this on purpose and invited him into the office to start the interview. He then proceeds to tell me that he has been fired from every job he has had, and it was never his fault though. stopping only to tell me that my hair was beautiful. He then stared at silence for me for like a good 10 seconds and then carried on about other jobs and how all his bosses had caused issues with him, but it was 100% not due to his punctuality. As he left, he lit a cigarette up inside the building, from which I rushed him out, to which he told me that I was being dramatic and that it's not like he's gonna burn down the bin like he did the last place. One of the guys that works on the level below me was outside smoking as he left and said hi to him. I went back upstairs. My coworker then comes up and asks me why I was so rude to this guy. I asked, of course, what he meant by that. Apparently the guy had gone outside and told my coworker that I had threatened him in order to get him out of the interview, and that I then told him that I don't employ people who are male, apparently. I obviously messaged him the day after informing him that he had been unsuccessful on this occasion, but thanks Kurt for coming, blah blah blah, all that formalities. That's when the phone calls started. He would ring the office at least 20 times a day and asking if he had been given the job position. Every time he was told no. I stopped answering the phone to him after a couple of days, so he started leaving voicemails. Not asking about the job, just laughing into the phone, then hanging up and doing the exact same thing. I haven't heard anything since 2 days ago, so hopefully he got bored and moved on to the next employer. Anyways, crazy job seeker, I would really like to not meet you again. I've never really shared this experience with anyone except my mom, a few close friends, and my boyfriend. But I don't think that they really realize how much this still impacts me. I recently discovered this subreddit, so I'm hoping sharing my experience will lift a weight, if you will. I work a fairly entry-level office job in a mixed commercial industrial area in my community. Because of the nature of most of the work in my area, mostly manufacturing and constructive type jobs, it wasn't uncommon to see people walking around in canvas pants, covered in oil, and just being a little dingy looking. I carpooled with my mom since she worked nearby, and that particular day my mom had called me to tell me she was going to be about half an hour late picking me up. Instead of waiting at my work for her, I decided I would just walk to the nearby coffee shop and wait for her there. It was late in the afternoon, around 4 p.m., and thus it was just very quiet. So I was the only customer in the shop when I sat down at a table to read a newspaper. A few minutes after I sat down, a very handsome, middle-aged guy walked in a few minutes behind me. He was very attractive and had a very comfortable charm to him, but it really struck me how clean he looked for this area, especially wearing coveralls and work boots. I didn't think too much of it at first, honestly, so when he asked me if he could sit with me and chat with me while he waited for his own ride, I said okay. We actually had a nice conversation for a little while, until he started asking personal questions about me. They were not very specific questions, but in hindsight it seems really weird to me. At the time though, perhaps it was just naivety? I just kept talking even though I started getting a really strange vibe from him. I started to get really uncomfortable when I asked him what he did for a living. He told me he worked at a nearby manufacturing place and that he had been working there for about a year. He then told me it was the first job he ever had, so he was really excited about continuing his career there. Remember, this guy is middle-aged. Not only what he said, but how he said it struck me as so strange. This became my first bold and waving real red flag to get the fuck out of here. I instantly had a moment where I was like, wait a sec. What middle-aged man is only 1 year into his first job? Especially in an area that can't really be shrugged off as prolonged education or rich parents or something like that. To me, that screams recent prison release. On top of that, for him to be so clean despite him saying where he worked, nothing was adding up. I immediately started texting my mom under the table and said that I was really uncomfortable and She needed to come ASAP. I continued talking like nothing was weird, but deep down I was really regretting telling him anything about myself, in case he decided to follow me. So when my mom pulled into the parking lot, I quickly, "Okay, thanks, bye," out of there and hopped in the car. As she pulled out of the parking lot, I see him leave the coffee shop and hop into his own car. Now, remember in our conversation he told me he was waiting for a ride. If I hadn't been paying attention to him and as he came in, I would have realized it was a lie and he drove him there himself, and I would have just avoided the whole situation entirely. Obviously, I'm really freaking the fuck out. I quickly explained to my mom what's going on and she sped off down the street. I looked behind us and guess who was there? It was that guy in his car. She purposefully ducked and drove down all sorts of bizarre streets and went in circle after circle. He followed us for close to 30 minutes before giving up. I don't know why I didn't report my experience to the police. I was just so shocked that something like that would happen. I went on with my life and shook it off as if nothing had happened. But fast forward about a week later and my mom picks up a newspaper, only to find that on the front page there's a picture on this one, and it's the very same handsome man. He had kidnapped a woman and shoved her into the trunk of her own car, drove her, while she was in the trunk, about 200 miles to another city, forced her to take all of her money out of a bank account, and then abandoned her there with no wallet and no vehicle. If not for my mom, I could have been screwed. Fortunately, the woman was not physically injured or sexually assaulted, but I could not imagine spending hours in the trunk of your own car not knowing what someone was going to do to you. It has been 7 years since this happened, and I still have some serious trust issues with strangers. I didn't work in that area much longer. It became too difficult for me. While I did work there, I had previously gone to that particular coffee shop daily during my lunch breaks, and still, to this day, I have never been back there. This is a story that my father has told me multiple times. My dad is a logger, specifically one who operates a tree saw, which is basically a giant machine that is capable of cutting down massive trees and cutting them to specified length, which means he spends a lot of time alone in deep forests. The way my dad's logging crew was set up is that he would be told where he was supposed to cut down trees, and he would go do that and be paid based on the amount of trees he cut, not how long it took him. So my dad used to work 16 to 20 hours a day constantly to get done as quick as possible, and then the rest of the crew would come clean up the trees and ship them to the mill. He used to work around 50% of the time alone, and the rest of the time with another tree saw operator named Rainey. They would use radios to communicate back and forth when they were working together. This is relevant down the line. Sorry for all the backstory, but it's just the start of the story. My dad and Rainey were put on a new job site, and we're about 10 days in, and everything was going as planned. But they were constantly hearing weird chitter-chatter all over the radio that was of such poor quality no words could be heard, and whatever radio channel they changed to, it followed them. As they progressed through the job and went farther up the mountains, the radio slowly became more audible. Both of them agreed, based on the small parts of conversations they were hearing, that something was wrong. They also started finding weird containers all over the places and signs that people had been here. People should not have been here. This was a 2.5-hour drive up a mountain. They had to spend 3 weeks clearing out the road so their trucks and equipment could even make it up. They come to a realization that they are in a very secluded area with people who shouldn't be there, and the worst part is that they aren't scheduled to leave for another week. They would only leave to refuel the fuel truck with gasoline for the machines. They would buy supplies and sleep in campers. One day, Rainey comes across a tent and calls my dad over. They investigate the tent and find one lone sleeping bag and a duffel bag. They investigate the duffel bag and find many pairs of children's underwear and things that appear to make up a small rape kit, like rope, duct tape, sketched images of children being molested, and photographs of children that appear unaware that they're being photographed. In the tent, they also find a small amount of food, which includes canned goods and an apple, which proves that the tent had been occupied recently because there was no mold on the apple. They are now on the mountain alone, which at best case scenario is just some really fucked up individual. Rainey instantly wants to get the fuck out of there, but my dad, being the hardest working person I've ever met, insists that they need to finish their job and then get the fuck out of there. They decide that they will not talk over radios except in cases of emergency and see if they can hear something over the radio. They are now in close enough range of whoever has been talking over the radio to hear the conversations between two men about collecting water and wood for the fire. Nothing abnormal except for the fact that these guys don't fucking belong up here and that this tent was undoubtedly theirs. At the end of the workday, my dad hears them on the radio talking about one of them collecting brush for a fire. My dad hops on the radio and attempts to communicate to them about what the fuck they're doing. I believe he said, "Who are you and what are you doing here?" After this, the conversation between the men abruptly stops and they never pick up. That night, Rainey wakes my dad up and whispers for him to get his gun, as someone's outside. My dad has told me that the first thing he hears when he wakes up was the quiet shuffling of footsteps. My dad fumbles for his gun and finds it, but realizes that he fucking doesn't even have it loaded and has little clue as to where the rounds are. And Rainey has nothing, and the thought of calling police is absurd for multiple reasons. They hear a jiggle on the doorknob and it opens. The camper is far enough off the ground where you had to jump in, and there is no ladder or footstool. It just stays open and neither my dad nor Rainey move. They hear scratching right outside the door. After 4 minutes of scratching, my dad can no longer take it and nods at Rainey. He gets up quietly and walks towards the camper door, and the second he reaches out, he is met with intense pain across his right eye, all the way to his left cheek. He has been cut and falls out of the camper, hitting the ground hard. A man with a knife gets on top of him, and soon he's being kicked in the top of his head by a man behind him. Rainey leaps out of the trailer and manages to get the man off my dad, and my dad gets up and realizes that the second man without the knife is running away, and that the man with the knife is scrambling away from Rainey and starts running alongside his accomplice. My dad and Rainey get into the truck and drive to the nearest hospital to treat my dad's cuts and later report the events to the police. They both quit their jobs, and 2 weeks later, as the rest of the logging crew is finishing up on the job, one of them was found bound, gagged, raped, murdered, and then thrown in a ditch. No one has ever been convicted of these crimes. To this day, my dad can hardly see out of his right eye, and the pupil is disfigured and looks more like a cat's eye than a human's. He suffers from PTSD from these events and hasn't had a good night's sleep ever since. This incident happened to me last year on Halloween. My little brother and I were home alone since our parents had gone out to a Halloween party. They had tasked us with handing out candy to the trick-or-treaters. This bummed out my brother and I because we had made plans to go trick-or-treating with a few friends. Our parents told us that we were too old to still be trick-or-treating and that we could instead invite our friends over to the house and hang out there. My friends declined my invitation to come over because they still wanted to go trick-or-treating. So that left me home alone with my brother handing out candy. A lot of people stopped by our house, and by 10 o'clock, almost all the candy was gone. My brother and I decided that we'd eat the rest. We were sitting on the couch watching a scary movie, stuffing ourselves with candy, when there was a knock at the door. I stormed off the couch, wondering who the hell could be knocking on our door this late. I assumed it was just some late-night trick-or-treaters. Even if that was the case, I had turned the porch light and Halloween decorations off, which should have been a dead giveaway that we were out of candy or that we weren't home. So I assumed it was my parents. Being cautious, I looked through the peephole and saw a suspicious man standing on our front porch. He was wearing a black hoodie with the hood over his head, which made it difficult to see his face. The only detail of his face I could see was that he had a beard and dry, crusty lips. There was no way this guy was a trick-or-treater because he wasn't wearing a costume and was far too old to be trick-or-treating alone. His hands were stuffed in his front pocket of his hoodie, and he also looked very thin. Every single red flag was going off in my head about this guy. There was no way in hell I was going to be opening the door. Still looking through the peephole, I watched as he knocked on the door again. He seemed desperate for us to open the door, and he was shaking a bit. It wasn't cold outside, definitely not cold enough for somebody to be trembling. He was giving me a bad vibe, and I wanted to get rid of him as soon as possible. "We're out of candy," I shouted to him. I watched as a smile spread across his face. It wasn't a friendly smile either. "Are you alone in there?" the man asked, almost in a mocking voice. His voice was raspy and dry. "Should I call the police?" my little brother asked me quietly, gripping his cell phone. The man let out a low grumble and said, "Sounds like you're not alone in there." I continued to watch him through the peephole. His hands were still wedged tightly in his pockets, and he was still shaking a bit. I began to wonder if he was armed. I decided to take action and spoke to him into the most intimidating voice I could muster. "Get the fuck away from my house or I'll call the police," I shouted. His smile faded and he bared his teeth. His teeth were piss yellow, and I concluded that he was probably some homeless crackhead. He had a look of fury plastered on his face. Fortunately, he left without trying to break in, probably because he knew I wasn't fucking around with him. I didn't stop watching him through the peephole until I saw that he was completely off of our property. My brother and I breathed a sigh of relief and decided not to call the police. My brother and I were a bit paranoid after this and watched TV until our parents came home. We didn't tell them about the man since he hadn't really tried to harm us. Now, when I think back to this, I wish I had called the police because maybe we would have been able to prevent a murder. You see, the next day we found out that the elderly woman who lived a few houses down from us had been brutally murdered. Her neighbor had found her lying on the front porch, covered in blood. She had been stabbed multiple times in the chest and neck. My brother and I immediately knew who had done it, and we told the police what we knew. They couldn't do much with the information we had given them, since we hadn't seen many details of his face. They went on a hunt for the man, but never caught him. I blame myself for that poor old lady's murder, because I could have prevented it from happening by just calling the police. I think the most disturbing thing of all was that he didn't even take anything from the old lady's house. Her house had been left untouched, but he could have gone in and taken whatever he wanted since the door was wide open. This means he just wanted to kill. That was his only intention. He didn't want money or jewelry. He only had the urge to murder somebody. So, creepy crackhead, Halloween slasher, let's not meet again.